Millionaire forces his daughter to marry a poor farmer, then uncovers a startling truth picture. A grand mansion perched on a hill, overlooking a sprawling cityscape, an image of power and wealth. Inside, an imposing father fixes his gaze upon his trembling daughter, forcing her toward a decision she never dreamed she'd have to make. On the opposite side of town, a humble farmer works tirelessly in his fields, oblivious to the storm about to befall him. Fate and a father's iron will bind these two lives together in a twisted arrangement. Yet hidden beneath these drastic measures lies a family's darkest secret, ready to erupt and change the course of their lives forever. Leonard Montgomery was the kind of man who commanded every room he entered. In his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with an air of unspoken authority. His wife, Josephine, had passed away many years ago, leaving him to raise their only daughter, Serafina Montgomery. He was a self-made billionaire with stakes in real estate, shipping and technology, and he owned one of the largest conglomerates in the city of Riverton. Word had it that he had powerful connections stretching to the corridors of the highest political offices. People whispered that whenever Leonard Montgomery's name was mentioned, the most influential listened. But for all the wealth and pomp that surrounded the Montgomery household, its foundation was built on an unsteady ground of secrets and unfulfilled desires. Leonard's one blind spot was his daughter, Serafina. While he had poured his blood, sweat and tears into making the Montgomery name legendary, Serafina had never been the kind of child who wanted to follow the conventional paths of the upper class. Rather than wearing designer dresses or planning exclusive social events, Serafina was more likely to be found at an orphanage supporting needy children or volunteering in community health programs. Early one morning, Serafina awakened to a surprise. Her father, in an unusually tense mood, summoned her to the grand study. The Montgomery mansion was so large that it took several minutes of brisk walking just to reach the massive wooden doors leading into Leonard's dominion. The study held dark mahogany shelves crammed with law books, company ledgers, and thick tomes about business strategy. Everything smelled faintly of old paper, cigar smoke, and the faintest hint of brandy. A man of strict discipline, Leonard rarely expressed softness, and Serafina felt her heart tighten as she entered. Leonard gestured for her to sit in one of the plush leather chairs before his desk. She complied, noticing that her father's jaw was set in that grim determination she had seen only a handful of times, moments which usually led to irrevocable changes. "Serafina," he began, voice firm, "you're 23 years old. You've never once shown an interest in the suitors I've introduced you to. You've refused to attend the high society gatherings. You've ignored potential alliances that could benefit our family enough. I've decided to take matters into my own hands." She inhaled sharply. "What do you mean, father?" Leonard folded his hands and narrowed his eyes. "You will marry Thomas Caldwell, the farmer who owns that tract of land on the outskirts of Riverton. And you will do so by this summer." Stunned silence. She blinked once, twice, then let out a burst of incredulous laughter. "Thomas Caldwell," she said, still half disbelieving. "A poor farmer on the outskirts of town? You can't be serious." Leonard remained unmoving. "I'm deadly serious." She stood up, heart pounding. "Why on earth would I marry Thomas Caldwell? We've never even met. And why would you want me to marry someone who's so far removed from our life?" Leonard let out a measured sigh. "I have my reasons," he said. "Wealth, position, and stability can come from many places. Serafina, not just suits and ties. The Caldwells own land that's crucial to certain business expansions I have in mind. But the primary reason is this: I refuse to see you waste your life in uncertainty. You need grounding." A wave of indignation rushed through her, colliding with confusion. Marrying a stranger is your idea of grounding me. I'd rather die than have my destiny dictated in such a way. Leonard's fists tightened. There will be no further argument. Our family's future, your future, and, he paused, a flicker of something unspoken dancing in his eyes. A crucial matter depends on this arrangement. You are my daughter, and I expect you to obey. Serafina felt that if she stayed in that room one more moment, she might lose her mind. She rushed out, heart hammering in her chest. She knew her father was stubborn, but never had she imagined he would force such a decision upon her. Despite her own confusion, a single question echoed in her mind: why Thomas Caldwell? On the other side of Riverton, in a humble but well-tended piece of farmland known as Green Meadow, Thomas Caldwell started his day before sunrise. With calloused hands and a gentle heart, Thomas, in his mid-20s, dedicated his life to his crops, his animals, and the small team of workers who helped keep the farm running. The Caldwell family had owned this land for generations, long before Riverton grew into a prominent city. Over the years, big businessmen, some with friendly dispositions, others with less gracious tactics, tried to buy out the Caldwell farmland to expand highways, build malls, or add factories. Thomas had always refused, holding on to his family's legacy. Living with him was his elderly grandmother, Beatrice Caldwell, a spitfire of a woman who had survived the Great Depression, 2 wars, and a few heartbreaks of her own. She taught Thomas everything he knew about perseverance, kindness, and the value of honest labor. She also occasionally dropped cryptic remarks about the Montgomerys, cautioning Thomas to be wary of them. Thomas had never put much stock in these warnings, figuring they were based on old rumors or prejudices from decades past. He was busy struggling to keep the farm profitable. Local produce markets had become saturated. Interest in organic farming was on the rise, but also highly competitive, and there were seasons where unexpected weather inflicted severe losses. That day, just as Thomas was finishing his morning chores, a sleek black Mercedes pulled onto the gravel driveway. The driver stepped out and politely asked for Thomas Caldwell. Thomas approached, wiping his hands on his work-worn jeans. The driver handed him a crisp envelope. Inside was an embossed card with a gold seal, an invitation to the Montgomery mansion, urging Thomas to attend a private dinner the following week. "Why would Leonard Montgomery want to speak with me?" Thomas asked, genuinely puzzled. The driver gave a curt bow and left without an explanation. Thomas stared at the invitation for a long moment, aware of the rumors swirling around Leonard Montgomery. Rumor had it that once Montgomery set his sights on a piece of land, he didn't rest until it was part of his empire. That knowledge set Thomas's teeth on edge. He had no intention of selling, but there was an unsettling sense of inevitability about the card in his hands, as if refusing would have consequences beyond what he could foresee. "Be careful," Grandmother Beatrice said in her time-worn voice when he showed her the invitation. "The Montgomery family, especially Leonard, carries the weight of power. Don't let them fool you into anything that would take away your birthright." He nodded, deciding that he would go to this dinner, but remained steadfast in his refusal to sell. What else could Leonard Montgomery possibly want? The following week, Thomas dressed in his best collared shirt and a simple navy blue blazer that looked slightly worn but presentable. He drove to the Montgomery mansion in his old pickup truck, greeted by a swarm of uniformed staff who guided him into a stately dining hall. Large crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting light against ornate paintings that presumably cost fortunes each. At the center of the room was a lavish table laid out with fine china. Leonard Montgomery stood at the head of the table, exuding regal authority in his impeccably tailored suit. Next to him sat Serafina, her composure guarded yet regal in her own right. She wore a simple black evening dress, more conservative than one might expect for an heiress, but she still carried the aura of a woman used to wealth. Nonetheless, Thomas could see a flicker of tension in her posture. Thomas Caldwell, Leonard greeted, extending a hand. He offered a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've wanted to speak with you for some time." Thomas shook the hand, noticing the man's grip was firm. "I'm here to listen, though I'm not sure what you'd want from a small farm like mine." Leonard motioned for Thomas to sit. Dinner was served by silent, efficient staff who moved in and out like shadows. The conversation was polite at first, focusing on general topics: harvest seasons, city expansions, charity events. Serafina hardly spoke, her gaze flitting occasionally towards Thomas, as though trying to gauge his character. He found himself returning her glances, reading curiosity and perhaps reluctant admiration. She was beautiful, yes, but there was also a quiet strength about her. Finally, as the last course was served, Leonard set his napkin down and cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, "I've brought you here for a proposition. I won't mince words. I want to consolidate a partnership. I want you to marry my daughter, Serafina, within the coming months." Thomas nearly choked on the glass of water he was sipping. He coughed, stunned. "Come again?" he managed to say, his face reddening. Leonard's tone remained steady. "I want my daughter to have a stable future, and your farmland has resources I've had my eye on for a while. If you agree to marry Serafina, there will be a substantial financial arrangement that will benefit you, your farm, and your grandmother. I will ensure your farm thrives in ways you never dreamed possible. I've researched you enough to know that you care deeply for that land. You have my word that if you agree to this marriage, I will not only let you keep your farm, I will invest in it." Thomas glanced at Serafina, who looked away, cheeks flushed with shame and anger. This was news to her, but she forced herself to remain composed. "This is insane," Thomas said. "I can't just marry a stranger because you think it's a good idea or because you wave money in front of me." Leonard's lips tightened. "I'm asking, not forcing," he said, though the edge in his voice suggested otherwise. "But consider the alternative. Riverton is expanding, one way or another. If you decline my offer, you might find yourself buried under so much legal red tape that it'll become impossible to keep your land profitable." It was a threat, hidden behind civility. Thomas felt heat rising in his chest. He turned toward Serafina, who finally summoned her voice. "I don't want this either," she said, glancing at her father. "But apparently, my father thinks this is best. He's not usually one to ask for second opinions." Silence fell. It was as though the tension in the air grew thicker, pressing down on every participant in that small corner of the dining hall. Thomas clenched his fists beneath the table. He hated being backed into a corner, and yet a seed of doubt planted itself in his mind. If the city were truly expanding at the speed rumored, how long could he hold out before corporate giants ate up everything around him? Moreover, he saw no cunning or malice in Serafina's eyes, just a sadness that mirrored his own uncertainty. "I'll need time to think about this," Thomas finally said. Leonard nodded, then turned to Serafina. "You'll speak with Thomas, won't you?" She gave a curt nod, as if she had no choice. And so the seed of a forced union was planted, one that neither party wanted, yet was being thrust upon them by the iron will of Leonard Montgomery. In the subsequent days, Leonard announced that Thomas and Serafina needed to get to know each other. If they were to be wed in a matter of weeks, a semblance of a courtship had to be staged to maintain appearances. Thus began an awkward series of outings. They attended a charity gala together, where Serafina spent most of her time explaining to high society acquaintances how Thomas was an up-and-coming entrepreneur in the agricultural sector. Thomas, who felt painfully out of place in the black tie affair, tried his best to remain calm, even as he felt the judgmental stares of elites who clearly saw him as a fish out of water. On another occasion, they were sent to review a potential property that Leonard wished to donate to a shelter. While Thomas appreciated the philanthropic angle, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a performance orchestrated by Leonard. Nevertheless, he discovered something during these forced outings. Serafina was no spoiled heiress. She was, in many ways, genuine and empathetic, showing more interest in the well-being of the people at the shelters than in discussing the next high society event. She would frequently slip away from reporters or acquaintances to help out the staff, and each time he witnessed these small acts of kindness, Thomas felt his initial resentment toward her soften. They were, after all, both pawns in Leonard's grand plan. Every so often, Serafina would break the practiced veneer they had to maintain. She'd ask Thomas about the harvest, about the orchard, about the animals. He would see real fascination in her eyes, as though she'd love to experience a life simpler than her father's empire. Similarly, Thomas found himself intrigued by her devotion to philanthropic causes. Their conversations, once stilted, began to flow more naturally. Meanwhile, Leonard continued to move the chess pieces behind the scenes, meeting with his business associates, quietly letting it be known that there would soon be a big wedding uniting two families of significant standing. Despite the forced nature of their interactions, Thomas and Serafina grew more comfortable with each other. However, both harbored a sense of injustice at being manipulated. They weren't puppets, and the more they discovered they had common ground, the desire for self-determination, fairness, respect for honest work, the more they found themselves allied against Leonard. Then came a day when Serafina decided she needed to see Caldwell Farm for herself. She had read about farmland life, but had rarely set foot on an actual working farm. A short phone call to Thomas was all it took. He agreed to pick her up and show her around. That morning, as he drove up to the Montgomery mansion in his trusty pickup truck, Serafina emerged wearing a simple white blouse, jeans, and sturdy boots. Leonard's disapproval was evident in the scowl on his face as he watched his daughter climb into the old pickup. But for once, she paid her father's expression no mind, slamming the passenger door behind her with a quiet sense of triumph. The drive was peaceful, with the windows rolled down, letting in the fresh air that smelled of earth and sun. Serafina rolled her eyes and made a wry joke. "I suppose my father would want me to arrive in a limousine, but I've never felt so free." Thomas chuckled, tension melting away. "He'll probably buy you one after you're married to me, some warped wedding present," he joked. But behind his humor lay a genuine frustration with Leonard's controlling ways. When they arrived at the farm, Serafina's eyes lit up. Rows of cornfields rustled in the breeze, barns were neatly kept, and animals seemed content, roaming in fenced pastures. Grandmother Beatrice emerged from the farmhouse, her bright eyes sizing Serafina up. "So you're the Montgomery girl," she said, arms folded. "You look kinder than that father of yours." Serafina offered a hand politely. "I'm pleased to meet you, ma'am. Thank you for allowing me to see your wonderful home." Beatrice sniffed but shook Serafina's hand. "It ain't much, but it's ours. You take care of it. If you end up living here? My boy's father and grandfather worked this land. We aim to keep it going, no matter what storms come." Serafina took a moment to wander through the orchard, picking fresh apples, breathing in their sweet fragrance. She visited the stable, where a few horses were kept, brushing her hand gently over the chestnut mare's mane. Something about the place made her shoulders relax. With every inch she explored, her respect for Thomas grew. This wasn't some idle fancy to keep a patch of grass. This was a legacy of hard work, where sweat and heartache were daily currency, far removed from the glitzy ballrooms she was used to. Thomas watched her from a distance, noticing how gracefully she moved through the farm. Part of him felt both relief and guilt. Relief that the woman he might be forced to marry wasn't the stereotypical spoiled heiress he'd feared. Guilt that he might have to accept her father's terms if he wanted to keep the farm safe. He told himself that if Serafina chose to walk away, he'd never blame her for it. But every time he reminded himself of Leonard's threats, he felt cornered, powerless. As the week passed, wedding plans were being laid out by Leonard's personal assistant and a hired wedding planner. A date was set only a month away, leaving little time for Thomas and Serafina to grasp the reality of what was happening. Invitations with embossed letters and swirling script were delivered across Riverton. Word spread quickly that a most unlikely union was on the horizon. One afternoon, while Thomas was reviewing wedding details at the mansion, an unexpected guest arrived, Leonard's lawyer, Michael Donovan, and an older man named Cecil Montgomery, Leonard's estranged cousin. Michael Donovan was a name that carried weight in legal circles. Known for his prowess in corporate law, he had been Leonard's right-hand man for decades. Cecil Montgomery, on the other hand, was an oddity in the family. He had parted ways with Leonard in their youth and had lived abroad for years, seldom returning to Riverton. Curious, Thomas greeted them politely, then retreated into the background, not wanting to intrude on family matters. He overheard hushed arguments in the hallway, fragments of conversation. Cecil's voice, husky and angry. "You can't just rewrite our family's history. Our bloodlines, the ownership of these estates, there's more at stake than you're telling your daughter." Leonard's controlled baritone. "Lower your voice. I will not have you meddle in Serafina's affairs. You lost your chance to have a say when you abandoned us years ago." Michael Donovan, diplomatically, "Gentlemen, let's remain calm." Eavesdropping from around a corner, Thomas tried to piece together the context. Rewrite our family's history? Ownership? Bloodlines? The mention of that last word set his nerves on edge. Was there something deeper behind this forced marriage? Thomas watched as Serafina, stepping out of her room, caught sight of the tension. She tried to approach, but Leonard cut her off with a curt wave of the hand, and Michael Donovan quickly guided her away, as though protecting her from hearing too much. Thomas noticed that same flicker of heartbreak on her face. She's always in the dark, he realized. Her father never explains anything. Later that evening, Serafina found Thomas seated on one of the mansion's ornate balconies. Gazing out at the city lights, lost in thought, she took a seat beside him. For a time, neither spoke. When she finally did, her voice was near a whisper. "My father's always been secretive, but I've never heard my cousin Cecil talk that way before. Something big must be going on." Thomas hesitated, considering how much he should reveal. Finally, he asked, "Has your father ever told you anything unusual about your family's past? Something about your mother or some inheritance?" She frowned. "No, not really. Mother passed away when I was young, and father hardly speaks of her. As for the inheritance, I assumed everything was straightforward, the Montgomery estates, the business. Why?" He told her what he had overheard about rewriting family history. "I'm not sure what it means," Thomas admitted, "but I get the sense that this arranged marriage might tie into something larger than we realized." Serafina looked troubled. "My father's manipulative, but I never expected secrets that sound so ominous." Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out, together. We have to, if we want to get out of this with our sanity intact." That night, a fierce storm ravaged Riverton, lightning illuminating the skies, thunder rolling like distant cannon fire. Serafina tossed and turned in bed, plagued by dreams of dark corridors and hidden doors. She awoke before dawn, determined to dig deeper into her family's archives. She tiptoed through the mansion, making her way to the restricted wing, a section sealed off after her mother's death. She'd been warned never to enter, but her father was still asleep, and desperation fueled her footsteps. At the end of a dusty hallway, she found a library with shelves of old documents and diaries, some bearing the Montgomery crest. Rummaging through one locked cabinet, the key of which she'd stolen from her father's desk months ago, out of sheer curiosity, she discovered a file labeled Caldwell-Montgomery Agreement Confidential. Her heart pounded. She opened it. Inside, she found several photocopied letters from decades past, referencing an Anna Caldwell-Montgomery. Seraphina's eyes widened. The name Caldwell Thomas's surname was scrawled alongside the name Montgomery. She read on, 1972, Anna Caldwell, an heiress to the Caldwell farmland, eloped with James Montgomery against her family's will. They had a child, but tragedy soon followed. Seraphina flipped pages, scanning for more details. She found a mention of farmland division, a claim that part of the Montgomery assets were derived from Caldwell property. Then more lines were blacked out. She read a chilling snippet. The child's lineage must be concealed until unification to restore rightful ownership. Baffled, Seraphina tried to piece together the puzzle. The Caldwell farmland evidently had a long, entangled history with the Montgomery family. Some ancient agreement or mishap must have split them, but how did it connect to her father's present insistence that she marry Thomas? Then a possibility struck her. Could it be that Thomas was, by blood, also tied to the Montgomery line? Or someone else in his family was? The file provided partial clues, but left gaping holes of confusion. Her thoughts whirled until she heard footsteps in the hallway. Panicked, she locked the cabinet, replaced the file, and hurried back to her room. The next day, Seraphina insisted on meeting Thomas at the farm, away from the prying eyes of the mansion's staff. She found him in the barn, shoveling hay. The earthy smell mingled with the faint sweetness of horse feed as sunlight streamed through the rafters. She approached him, breathless. "Thomas," she began, voice trembling with urgency, "I need you to look at something." She handed him a small snippet of the photocopied letters she'd managed to slip into her pocket. Thomas read carefully, brow furrowing, Anna Caldwell Montgomery, some farmland. Some secret child? He frowned. "I know my great-aunt Anna was rumored to have a secret marriage in her youth, but she vanished from public records. My grandmother Beatrice rarely speaks of her." Seraphina bit her lip. "Thomas, if there was a union between our families in the past, do you think that means you and I share some claim to each other's properties? Or that one side effectively owes the other something?" He set the papers aside, the color draining from his face as realization dawned. "My grandmother always mentioned that an older portion of our farmland was sold to a Montgomery decades ago, but she never told me the details. Could it be that our families were once part of the same lineage and a falling out caused a rift?" They looked at each other, a dawning horror creeping into their eyes. "Are we related?" Seraphina breathed, the words shaking her to her core. Thomas shook his head fiercely. "No, that can't be. The time frame's all wrong for us to be siblings or first cousins. Maybe this Anna Caldwell married into the Montgomerys, but there must have been further branches." Still, the thought of blood relation, no matter how distant, sickened them. Seraphina steadied herself. "We need real facts, but from these documents, it looks like your farmland was once legally part of the Montgomery estate, or vice versa, and a marriage was used to unify them. Now, maybe my father is trying to replicate that arrangement in some twisted 20th century version." Thomas took a deep breath, wrestling with the revelation. "We can't let him manipulate us. If there is something about your father needing to unify the properties, that's his problem. We have a right to know the truth." Seraphina nodded. "We do, and we'll uncover it, no matter the cost." In the days that followed, both Thomas and Seraphina tried prying information from those who might know. For Thomas, that meant confronting his grandmother, Beatrice. For Seraphina, that meant persuading her father's cousin, Cecil Montgomery, to share what he knew. Thomas and grandmother Beatrice, he found her dozing in her rocking chair one afternoon, the sunlight filtering through lace curtains. "Grandma," he said softly, "I need to know about Aunt Anna, about the Caldwell-Montgomery arrangement." Beatrice woke, blinking. At first she tried to dismiss him, but Thomas persisted. "This is important, Grandma. Leonard Montgomery is forcing me and Serafina into a marriage, and I have reason to believe it's connected to some old family secret." Beatrice sighed heavily. "Your Aunt Anna was a free spirit. She fell in love with James Montgomery, Leonard's older brother. The Caldwell and Montgomery families were at odds, but Anna and James eloped. James died in a tragic accident shortly after they had a child. Anna disappeared for years. Some say she was locked away, others say she fled abroad. In the aftermath, there were tangled lawsuits about the farmland and inheritance." Thomas's heart pounded. "What about the child?" Beatrice shook her head. "I don't know what happened to that child. I only know that the Caldwell farmland was partially transferred to the Montgomerys for a time. When Anna reappeared, she fought to reclaim it. She lost, then she died under mysterious circumstances." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "So Leonard might be continuing this fight, using me and Serafina to secure the land once and for all. But why force a marriage now, decades later?" Beatrice lowered her gaze. "Leonard is cunning. Perhaps he believes combining the families again will erase any remaining legal claims that you or Serafina might have. By uniting you two in marriage, the farmland is merged into the Montgomery Empire forever." Serafina and Cecil Montgomery, meanwhile. Serafina cornered Cecil in a hallway at a posh country club where she knew he frequented. She confronted him with the partial documents. "Cousin Cecil, you have to tell me the truth. My father refuses to share anything, and I know you're at odds with him. Please help me understand." Cecil sighed, looking conflicted. "Your father was a second son. James was the favored heir. After James died and Anna vanished, your father rose to become the head of the family. But there was always a rumor about the child, James's child with Anna. Some said the child had a right to the Montgomery name. Some said the Caldwell farmland should have gone entirely to that child. Nobody could find the child, and your father inherited everything uncontested. Does father think the Caldwell line has a claim to the Montgomery fortune?" Serafina asked. Cecil nodded grimly. "Yes, but it's all buried under decades of legal tangles. My guess is that marrying you off to Thomas Caldwell might be a way to tie up loose ends." "That's monstrous," Serafina murmured, feeling a wave of revulsion. Cecil grabbed her arm gently. "Be cautious. There's more to this than property lines. The Caldwell family may not be entirely innocent either. Your father is obsessed with ensuring no one challenges his rightful claim. If you marry Thomas, all claims unify under your father's blessing. If you two refuse, he might find a more ruthless way to destroy the Caldwell claim once and for all." As the wedding date inched closer, the city buzzed with gossip. The bride and groom each day appeared more reluctant. Yet something else was happening in their shared plight. Serafina and Thomas were forging a connection. They spent long hours confiding in one another, discussing not only the fiasco with their families, but also their personal dreams, hopes, and fears. Serafina found solace in the farm's simplicity. Thomas, surprisingly, grew fascinated by the philanthropic world Serafina championed. One warm afternoon, they took a walk through an orchard that glimmered with golden sunlight. The gentle hush of rustling leaves enveloped them. They stumbled upon an old wooden bench under a sprawling apple tree. Serafina sat, gazing at the horizon. "If this were under any other circumstances," she said softly, I think I'd be happy to spend more time with you, learn about your life, maybe even fall in." She halted, cheeks flushing. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. "I feel the same. This is crazy. We're being forced to marry. Yet I'm finding myself drawn to you." Their eyes locked, charged with unspoken emotions. In that tender moment, they sealed their silent alliance. If they had to face Leonard's manipulations, they would do it together. A week before the wedding, Leonard demanded that Thomas sign a prenuptial agreement. Michael Donovan arrived at the Caldwell farm with a stack of legal paperwork, accompanied by an entourage of stern-faced lawyers. On the surface, the prenuptial agreement was straightforward. If Thomas and Serafina divorced, the farmland would remain in the Caldwell name, but with certain business privileges granted to Montgomery Industries. However, hidden in the fine print was a series of clauses that suggested if any legal dispute regarding Caldwell-Montgomery inheritance arose, the farmland could automatically revert to Leonard's control unless Serafina and Thomas remained married for at least 5 years. Thomas fumed. "This is an outright threat disguised as a contract," Donovan shrugged. "It's a standard business arrangement. Mr. Caldwell, Mr. Montgomery wants to protect both parties' interests." Serafina, who stood by Thomas's side, met Donovan's gaze with cold fury. "You can tell my father that I see through this. He's basically chaining us for 5 years to ensure no claims arise. Let him know we sign under protest." Their defiance, however, didn't matter. The marriage license was signed, the wedding date final. All that remained was to walk down the aisle. At last, the dreaded day arrived. The grandest cathedral in Riverton was decorated with thousands of lilies and roses. Dignitaries, tycoons, local celebrities, and even some politicians arrived in sleek cars, crowding the streets. The air was electric with curiosity. Would the union of Montgomery wealth and Caldwell farmland create a new dynasty in Riverton? Serafina, wearing a lace gown that shimmered with understated elegance, felt no joy. She stared at her reflection in the cathedral's side room, tears threatening to spill. "This is not how I envisioned my wedding day." And yet, the thought of Thomas waiting at the altar gave her a strange sense of calm. At least, they were in this together. Meanwhile, Thomas, clad in a tailored suit provided by Leonard's personal stylist, paced back and forth in a small chapel room. His grandmother Beatrice was there, tears shining in her aged eyes as she held his hand. "Remember who you are, Thomas," she whispered. "No matter what happens, the Caldwell name stands for honesty and perseverance." When the organ music began, the entire cathedral fell silent. Serafina made her grand entrance, escorted by Leonard, whose face was a mask of triumph. Thomas watched her approach, heart heavy but struck by her beauty. He offered her his hand at the altar, and they stood before the officiant, vows prepared in typical grandeur. But as the officiant asked if anyone objected, an unexpected voice echoed through the cathedral. "I do." A murmur swept the congregation. Serafina and Thomas whirled around. It was Cecil Montgomery, eyes blazing. He raised a folder. "I have proof that this marriage is built on deception, Leonard's deception. Before these two pledge their lives, I demand the truth be made public." Chaos erupted. Leonard's face blanched. Michael Donovan rushed to hush Cecil, but the older cousin pushed past him and handed the folder to the officiant. "This," he declared loudly, "is the genealogical record of the Caldwell-Montgomery lineage, along with a confession from one of Leonard's former associates. It proves that Thomas Caldwell's great-aunt was indeed Anna Caldwell Montgomery, who had a legitimate claim to half the Montgomery estate. This forced marriage is Leonard's strategy to secure that claim once and for all under Montgomery control." Stunned silence. Leonard tried to compose himself, but the swirling rumors in the crowd grew deafening. Cecil wasn't finished. "Moreover, I have a letter from the late Anna Caldwell Montgomery herself, stating that if any Caldwell descendant challenged the Montgomery claim, they could rightfully inherit a sizable portion of the Montgomery fortune." Leonard's plan to force Thomas and Serafina into marriage, then tie it up with a prenuptial agreement, was a preemptive strike to prevent a legal takeover. Serafina turned to her father, tears in her eyes. "Is this true?" Leonard trembled with fury. "It's complicated." I did what I had to, for the family's sake. Thomas's voice was ragged. You manipulated us, forced us, just so you could dodge a rightful claim? Leonard's face hardened. Caldwell farmland would have been ours decades ago if not for Anna's interference. The only solution was to unify the lines again. My daughter benefits from wealth and stability, and you keep your precious farm. It's a fair trade. Your idea of fair is twisted, Serafina spat, the heartbreak in her voice echoing off the cathedral walls. Tension hung in the air like a thick fog. The priest looked helpless, unsure whether to proceed with the ceremony or not. The entire congregation waited, breath bated, for the next move. Serafina turned to Thomas, tears glistening. We can't do this, not under these conditions. Thomas took her hands. No, we can't, Leonard snapped. Serafina, you will continue this ceremony. We've come too far. The entire city is watching. Do you want to bring shame on your family? She shook her head. No, father. You already did that by lying and manipulating. I won't be part of your scheme anymore. An angry hush fell over the cathedral. Cameras rolled, capturing the moment. Cecil stepped forward. I may not have the best relationship with Leonard, but I cannot stand by while an injustice is done. If the bride and groom wish to call off the wedding, let them. The truth is out now. Let the legal chips fall where they may. Leonard looked as if he might explode, but there, before hundreds of onlookers, he could do nothing but tighten his jaw. Thomas sighed, turning to the officiant. I'm sorry, but we can't proceed. Not like this. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The wedding was off. In the days that followed, the Montgomery Empire faced a whirlwind of gossip and legal intrigue. Cecil's documents prompted an investigation, and sure enough, it was determined that Thomas Caldwell had a legitimate claim to a significant portion of the Montgomery holdings. Rather than face a drawn-out legal battle, Leonard was forced to negotiate. Ultimately, he had to cede a large financial settlement and partial business interests to Thomas, in recognition of the Caldwell-Montgomery lineage. Caldwell Farm remained wholly Thomas's, and with the settlement, he was able to modernize the farm, hire more workers, and expand into more lucrative organic markets. As for Serafina, she left her father's mansion, renting a modest apartment downtown. She invested her time and resources into her charities and social ventures, forging her own path separate from Leonard's overshadowing presence. Though hurt and angry at her father's betrayal, she knew she had to begin life on her own terms. Leonard Montgomery found himself in a rare position, vulnerable and publicly shamed. Shareholders questioned his leadership, politicians distanced themselves, and he had to fight to regain the trust of his peers. Surprisingly, he also experienced a degree of introspection he had never allowed before. At first, he tried to contact Serafina to demand forgiveness, but eventually realized that only humility and genuine remorse might open a path to reconciliation with his daughter. Weeks turned into months. Riverton found a new balance. Talk of the aborted wedding became old news, overshadowed by new scandals, new politics. Yet something continued to linger between Thomas and Serafina. Despite their public declaration that they would not marry under Leonard's manipulations, the bond they had formed was real. One autumn day, Serafina returned to Caldwell Farm, bringing a donation of surplus medical supplies for the local clinic. She found Thomas overseeing the construction of a new greenhouse. They greeted each other with an awkward yet warm smile. "You're doing well," she observed, looking at the improvements. "I'm glad." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, slightly bashful. "I owe part of that to the settlement from your father. I've tried to use it wisely. If you have time, I'd love to show you the orchard upgrades." She nodded, a gentle laugh escaping her lips. You might have to remind me not to crush the saplings with my city boots. They strolled among rows of newly planted fruit trees, their conversation calm and reflective. When they reached the old bench under the sprawling apple tree, where they had once confessed their hopes, Thomas paused. "I was thinking about you," he admitted, "wondering if you ever wanted to come back here under better circumstances." Serafina lowered her gaze. "I've been thinking about you too," she smiled, a bit shy, "about what we shared and how, despite everything, it felt so real." Thomas exhaled, the tension in his shoulders releasing. "Then maybe we can start fresh? No forced contracts, no hidden agendas, just us." A tear slid down Serafina's cheek, but it was a tear of relief, of hope. "I'd like that very much, Thomas." They sat on that old bench for a long time, talking about everything from orchard plans to potential charity ventures. In time, they realized that what began as a forced union had blossomed into a genuine connection. Neither needed the promise of farmland or the Montgomery Empire. They only needed each other's honesty, kindness, and respect. As the months and years passed, Thomas and Serafina carved out a future that defied the manipulative origins of their meeting. Leonard Montgomery, humbled by public scrutiny and his daughter's estrangement, eventually sought to atone for his past actions. In time, he and Serafina reopened lines of communication cautiously at first, but always with honesty at the core. Thomas continued to honor his family's farming heritage, and Serafina carried on championing social causes that made Riverton a better place. Their shared journey reminds us that true love and genuine connection cannot be built on lies or intimidation. Instead, it flourishes in honesty and mutual respect. If you've been moved by this dramatic tale of hidden secrets, forced choices, and unexpected redemption, please show your support. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for more real-life drama stories that inspire, entertain, and uplift the heart. Thank you for watching.